Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as historical document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, man.
Man, things are going good. Our introduction
Yes.
says about you
Yes.
that you are, there's like 4 or 5 things that you, writer, producer, and I think executive, because I know you work for this very high-tech, famous, radio speaker.
Yes.
But did you become an actor?
That's debatable. Long story short, a dear producer friend invited me to audition for a TV series that she has been producing. I auditioned. I got the part. We filmed it. It was very exciting.
Oh, nice.
And I have a new appreciation for what real actors go through, and I certainly had a good time.
Yeah.
And reassured yet again I belong behind the camera.
Well, now listen, I know you have spent years, actually decades, directing. You haven't done it all the time, but you have definitely directed, I'll use the word multiple, I think that's correct, multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe in your very first film, which I may still have a copy somewhere, you
right.
were an actor also, right?
I was.
it Love Endures? Is that what it was called?
That's right. Wow.
Hey, come on, man. I know you. You're my buddy.
Yeah,
We're close
you're
friends,
OG,
brother.
man. Yes, out of necessity, I was one of the 4 main actors. From there, I'm like, I'll leave it to you guys.
So now, years on, after
Yes.
that first time, you've tried the acting seat again, and your conclusion is maybe you should stay behind the camera?
I am drawn to challenges, which
Okay.
can be a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
and bad thing. Some challenges, you're like, yes, and I overcome. And there's other challenges like, you can't fix a car engine. That's okay. That's not a mountain you have to climb, Matthew. So my whole life is differentiating which windmills to run at and which ones to let go.
Well, I'm not going to press you for a name or date or anything like that, but at some point, maybe you might see, of course, some of you don't know what Matthew or I look like, but you might see Matthew Porter's name on a TV show.
Yes.
So speaking of mountains to climb, we've been climbing one, because it is a challenge, because I'm trying to not convince people about Christianity, but I'm trying to look as a historian, and many of you, most of you, would not be somebody who would say I'm a historian. So we're trying to understand how historians do their work and all that kind of stuff. And we've kind of made our way through a fairly consistent, or 2/3 of the way through, I think, what the key journey is. We actually have this one episode where we're going to hit one more historical point, and then we're going to all bring it to bear the following episode on what I believe is the core historical event from the Bible. We'll leave that for later. So do you have any questions about anything we did canon for 3 episodes?
We did canon. Just top line summary, what in your words would be our takeaway from the canon episodes? That process probably is maybe a little bit different than what people perceive it to be.
Yeah, I think
it's my take.
Yeah, I think either some people, let's say probably fans of Christianity, would think almost like God himself came down with 66 books and said, here you go, boys. This explains everything.
Yep.
And then if you thought like that and you read the Bible, you're going to be really disappointed, because it doesn't read like that at all. It reads like history and poetry, and there's all kinds of different literary stuff. On the other hand, if you're someone who's opposed to Christianity, your thought may be, well, a bunch of dudes randomly sat around a table and said, let's make up a story, because all religions have a story, and we'll just make ours up too. And they just created stuff and just said, let's go, 500 years back. Nobody's alive still. Nobody will know. And they just started writing stuff down, pick some stuff they found, throw some stuff together, just sort of randomly cherry picked out of a pot. They looked at a bunch of things, and that story's also inaccurate, completely inaccurate, not even close to being accurate.
And the ground we've been covering over the last many episodes is basically, in some, saying that theory just does not square with facts, historical facts, archaeological facts, anthropological, whatever.
Right. And one of the things I say about it, and I may have said it in episode 1 or 2, as a historian, there's always a sense in which every sentence that I'm saying, every conclusion that I'm rising to has kind of an ellipse after it where then it's like, as best we know the evidence.
Sure.
Meaning we're open to the evidence. So actually just today, I was watching a documentary about a place you and I have been together, Pompeii.
Oh, yes.
And they're still doing digs in Pompeii. They're still finding stuff. They haven't found anything new.
Right. But they found a new wrinkle, right?
Well, what do you think they found?
That people return to it.
Oh, no, I don't know that part. Tell me.
Okay. I just saw the headline, but the idea being so many years after what feels like established facts, certainly we have our arms around everything.
Right.
Something new comes up that makes us go, well,
yeah,
let's loosen our grip on what we know.
And be open.
To new evidence.
Right. So one of the cool things they found, you'll love this, is they found evidence that in Pompeii, so 79 AD, they were making pizza.
This is the history I can get behind.
I'm telling you what, they found a bakery. They've discovered a bakery.
Yeah.
They've opened it up.
Yes.
And on the wall, there was a fresco that was done that had a plate of food. It doesn't seem like that wasn't like a menu. It was just like, this is beautiful stuff in our bakery.
Yes.
And one of the options, at worst, it's flatbread.
Okay.
But it is flatbread with toppings. And so I call that pizza.
But was there pineapple in Pompeii? That's the real.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Everybody wants to avoid the hard questions.
I don't know. And I don't know if there was any ham or not.
Yeah.
But here's to take it to a slightly more serious point.
Yeah.
They didn't go, oh, it turns out this is not Pompeii, it's Fredericksville. Or it wasn't covered with ash. Evil Carthaginians rolled in and covered it with dirt all one night and killed everybody.
Right.
Right. So the story remains stable, and we're getting new evidence or new pieces of the puzzle, and that's what historians are kind of constantly doing. So like I said, it's a mountain to climb in a sense of getting to understand. And as you're going, you're realizing this set of historical documents now about this thing called Christianity. And their version and the Jewish version of the one true God, and I've used the phrase "the Maker," is historically stable. All right, so that's kind of the key thing. And I do understand. So again, listeners, hopefully you are listening to the intro. And in the intro, we talk about how our focus will be on like why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for our civic system. And you might think, well, wait, you haven't answered that question. And I get it that we haven't like called that question out and then tried to give some sort of specific answer to that specific question. I mean, we might in the conclusion or at some point try to, but in one sense, my mentality coming in is that the entire podcast is answering that question. That if I show you the Bible as historical document and that whether it is or is not, and I think the evidence is coming out that it is historically secure, you go, oh, okay, I get it. So when we discover the Bible is historically secure, if what we read is what was written, so we're going to talk about today, it holds up historically, then that is the point at which the founders thought this is useful for that moral virtue foundation. So, for instance, and if you go back to Unmoored, you would have heard me go in depth on these guys, but when John Adams says, quote, public virtue is the only foundation of a republic, he says that in 76, and he's talking about, and he uses the word virtue, which you and I can say, well, he means any kind of virtue. But when you know John's life, you go, no, he doesn't mean any kind of virtue. He's talking about Christianity. Mm-hmm. Or later, at the time of his farewell address in 1786, George Washington says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, and he doesn't mean for a political party, he means for the nation civically, religion and morality are indispensable supports. They are focusing on Christianity, the Bible, as the foundation of that view. Now, we're not saying, you and I, at least we aren't saying it yet, that, and we didn't say this in Unmoored, that you, the listener, must accept the Bible as the location of that virtue or that morality for today. But I am saying the founders did so. It was at the time of founding, the nation was a nation peopled mostly with Christians, and so their understanding of the Bible. So then as you and I sit here in the early 21st century, we're thinking about, can I see why they said it? Is there a reason why they said it? And then what do I, as a person alive now, do with that? Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me, man. Okay.
Well, I hope you only got a couple more episodes of the podcast. I hope you keep listening, and I hope that as you do so, you'll be able to see that I am demonstrating that the Bible is historically secure. All right, so let's dive on in here. Back in episode 3, I said a way to understand this is through a series of questions. That's the way I like to think about it. So we've covered 2 of these questions. So the first one we've covered is that the text of the Bible as a thing on manuscript scrolls, that text is historically secure. The idea of a thing called Matthew, a thing called, go to the Old Testament, Chronicles, a thing called Malachi, a thing called First Corinthians, that is secure, that we have those copies, not the original, but we have the copies, and it's the strongest manuscript evidence in all of antiquity. And, as we were just talking about, we've established that the collection of books, the thing called the canon, was collected early within the lifetime of the disciples themselves, and it was free from external influence. They were aware of other writings, and very early in the process, the various collection of believers in the various locations across the Mediterranean region had come to a high degree of clarity and agreement of which books are we talking about do we think are quote unquote from God or inspired by God to help us understand this thing that we're living out, this the way, and what eventually becomes Christianity. All right. But that leaves us to, I think, 2 more questions. We're going to try to do both today. I think we can do both today. Although if you took one of these, either one of these, and you went in depth, you're talking about a multi-hour in-depth thing. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do kind of a survey glance. But so the one question you would say is, since it's true you have no originals, aren't there a lot of variations in the text that even the experts can't solve? And that could mean when I pick up a Bible, a person might think, well, I'm reading this sentence in what you all call a verse, but I don't know for sure if that's what was written in the original, because you don't have the originals. And then secondly, looking at the collection of information, someone could say, as I've examined, or probably more likely heard about it, in these evidences, it seems like there can be contradictions. And if you remember, dear listener, back to episode 2, I think, or 3, we told you about the assassination of Julius Caesar and how in our leading documents there are contradictions on the evidence. So then somebody might say, well, if I can't trust the evidence, I'm not going to if it can't get its own story straight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Real questions.
Okay, so these are dealing with the actual words, actual sentences. So we're going to kind of dive in there. We don't have the autograph. So let's start with this fact here. This question, both these ideas, are the same for any and all writings of antiquity. Remember, we don't have the autograph. Remember, the autograph is the original. That's the term. It's probably autographa, probably more likely, but I've always just called it the autograph. And it connects to what we think. We hear the word autograph thinking, oh, this famous person signed this thing for me. And if you've ever done like sports or entertainment memorabilia and you go to a store and buy one, you didn't see them sign it, there's usually some kind of a certificate of authenticity that, yes, this really is signed by this person. And so you're saying, oh, at one point, this person I love or admire, they held this, they signed it with a pen. It's the original signature, and that's how the 2 words, autograph as we understand it, and then autographa or autograph, related to history stuff, kind of connects here. So we don't have the autographs for anything prior to, as I told you, really 11th century, start having some poems and some songs, and then 12, 13, get closer to the printing press. Then we're good from that point on. So experts in the field, in any field, what happens is you spend your lifetime becoming an expert to get a deep knowledge of the language. They become experts in the type of material that someone writes on at different points in time through the centuries. The writing material itself shifted and changed, even the style of writing. So, even if you think about it, like we don't do a lot of cursive writing these days. And so if you ask somebody like your children to do cursive writing, it might be written differently in cursive than, say, 50 years ago because cursive was taught differently, right? So someone could become an expert in English, America, United States cursive handwriting and realize just with a glance, oh, as an example of that, in a lot of writings in early American and British history, say 1700s, the letter S is usually written as an F.
Right. Congraph.
And so when you look at it, you're like, wait, a bunch of F's. So if you just picked up a piece of paper and it had that on it and you're an expert, you go, oh, this could not have been written in the 1900s.
Right.
I mean, somebody could fake it, but that'd be why you look at other things.
Right.
Does that make sense there?
Yeah, that's a good illustration.
So all of this collectively is what is known as like a textual criticism or textual expertise. So a person goes out of their way through their study. And again, this could be in anything, any field existing where you're looking for, like, the oldest playwrights, right? So there's experts in those fields and they become experts in those people, kind of a thing. And for Christianity, now remember, with the Bible, there are copies and copies of the original. And so this raises that question, because if there's copies and copies and copies over the years, over the decades, even centuries, certainly there is a great potential for variation to happen between the original and the copy. And again, listener, we literally could spend hours going into this, but if you've never looked into it, go look into it as to how were copies made. And there's different things you'll find in different times and places, but in general, until we get to the printing press, there was people who had jobs of basically copying documents. Sometimes it was monks, sometimes people working in libraries, it was people on payrolls. We've mentioned Charlemagne here before. I mean, he had official scribes who were not monks or Christians necessarily. They're just people who worked for the government, and one of the things they did was make copies of older manuscripts. So they wanted to have, in case there was a fire, in case there was a problem. And so they wanted to have more and more copies of these things. And so they were professionals in what they did. But think about the time in which they lived. There's no eyeglasses. So I have eyeglasses on. So there's a part where you can imagine my eyes might struggle at different points depending on the lighting. There was no interior lighting. So it doesn't mean they were always in the dark, but you had variety of kind of atmospheric differences that can play a role. They would do this for hours on end. So if you've done anything that's not tedious, but I mean, taking that kind of level of focus, it's not like you're sitting there watching a TV show while you're texting and you're not really paying attention. That's not the point. It's like you're really focused in on something. And it's easy to see how you can misalign, misread something, kind of get confused. One sentence of the thing you're copying from ends with a word that is nearly identical. Think for us, the word these, T-H-E-S-E, and there, T-H-E-R-E. And if they were two lines apart and one line ended with these and then two lines later it ended with there, you might glance at that second line and it says T-H-E-R-E, but your brain thinks of the T-H-E-S-E that you just wrote two lines above and you throw these in there. And you're not trying to make a mistake or cause a problem. You're just doing your job and you're going line to line to line. So as those kinds of things happen, the listener, you guys, hopefully you can see how variations can emerge into the text. All right. So textual criticism, then you could define it like this, is the discipline by which experts, again, any field, work with all of the manuscripts of a document to then be able to provide us, the reader, with the best, most accurate rendition of the text as possible at that point. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So remember when we talked about, back to the historicity question with like Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, and there's only like, I think 40, 50 copies. And then we talked about the Iliad had several hundred copies. Well, so the experts are either limited or have different challenges based on the number of copies that they have. And so that kind of plays a role. Okay, we'll get back into this, but before I just want to make sure we get this for everybody, and you can see how this works out like historically. So we've mentioned Josephus many, many times in here. He's an important first century historian, first person participant in some examples of things happening in Jerusalem. He's a Jewish man who ultimately will be captured and sort of work his way into a favorable position within the Roman army. Remember, we talked last time about Titus. And so he ends up connecting there and with the armies there, and he does a lot of writings and stuff. Well, in one of the earlier episodes, I talked about how there's a quote that he has about Jesus. And Josephus is not a fan of Jesus. He does not become a Christian. He's somebody who's just kind of reporting about the histories, and so he's writing about this. And for years, many people, in fact, you can still find this online, many people say, well, he didn't really write that. They think it's a later insertion by a scribe.
Okay.
Okay, so fair enough. So did he write it? Did he not write it? This is this idea of textual criticism. Now, this isn't getting into whether all of the words in the lines are identical, but still it kind of gets close enough to make the point that I'm trying to make. Well, there's been new research that's been done. A man named Tom Schmidt, he wrote a book released this year called Josephus and Jesus. If you're interested in Josephus, if you're interested in this whole idea of textual criticism, it'd be a great entry point for you to go read. Now, if you're not interested in this stuff, you might find a lot of his writing really narrow and so overly detailed your eyes glaze over. I love that stuff, so I was into it. But somebody else might go, I can't read this. All right. So he did research on Josephus and looking at the text, looking at all the things Josephus wrote, at the textual information. He's an expert in the language. He's an expert in Josephus. So he's an example of this kind of textual criticism. And one of the things that critics sometimes say about this quote is that the quote uses unique vocabulary, meaning it's using words that Josephus would not naturally use.
Okay.
And we can pick up on that.
Yeah.
I mean, we've heard people talk either in tone that doesn't sound like their natural tone, or maybe they're throwing a word around you going, do you really know what that word means? Like not a word they would normally use.
Yeah, an outlier. It just it points to itself.
And if we're with friends, we call them on it. And we're like, hey, you trying to show off? Gotta
Trying to look perspicacious.
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
Look at you.
So what Schmidt discovered through his research is that Josephus was someone who was highly educated. He had a unique and vast vocabulary. And it turns out that roughly every 80 words, which you're going like, who cares? 80, 90 words, he uses a unique word. So his vocabulary was so big, he's dropping in fancy words every paragraph or so, which for him, he didn't think of them as fancy words.
Right. It's on brand for Josephus.
Exactly. Guess how long the quote is for Jesus about Jesus?
I don't know.
85 to 90 words.
85 to 90 words.
Meaning, if someone goes, that can't be from Josephus, it's using unique vocabulary. It's like, turns out that's exactly
average.
That's exactly what he does.
If he had written 160 more, you might have heard another one.
Yeah, and if it was the other way, like maybe every word was unique, okay, fine, he didn't do that. Or if there were no unique words, then you might go, maybe somebody made that up.
So if you're coming to this in an intellectually honest way, all of a sudden that's pretty much off the table as far as an objection. You're like, you're right. That asked and answered, that kind of explains it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's this great quote in the book that I'm going to read to you guys. Almost all of the 90 words made up in the section on Jesus are embedded within phrases that are used by Josephus in other areas of his work, with only 3 phrases. Again, this is how narrow this gets. This might bore some of you. With only 3 phrases that have no parallels elsewhere, and several more phrases with only 1 or 2 parallels elsewhere. But this is exactly the kind of frequency pattern which would be anticipated if Josephus had actually written this quote. Not only this, all 3 of the unique phrases are further evidence suggesting that they are clearly from Josephus. So it's like, do the textual criticism work, get into the document, and all of a sudden what you find is support for this. And this author would have clearly gone the other direction if the evidence had come out that, nope, it's clearly not Josephus. It's a bunch of words that are never made up by him. So A, listener, that's what critics do. That's the whole job.
Yeah.
And then B, specifically for Josephus, you go, so when I read that quote, it really is about Jesus. And again, I hasten to add, when you read it, if you look it up, and I'll try to maybe put a link in the show notes. If you look it up, isolated and without knowing the wording, you might think, this is sounding like it's pro-Jesus, like it's supportive of Jesus, which is why basically people who are critics of Christianity like to suggest that Josephus didn't write it.
Yeah.
But this author went deeper into the vocabulary used to say, when you see this word here, and there's some words about kind of the deeds that Jesus did that are kind of supernatural, he means that in a negative way, like this is terrible. This is not a good thing. For a good person would not do these things. So anyway, that's what a textual critic does. So is the Bible free of variance? Nope. Are there any works of antiquity free of variance? Also no.
Yeah.
Every work of antiquity, which we do not have the autograph, has variations due to the copying. So it is historically true. This is really important for Christians because a lot of Christians get really funky about this and they get all like argumentative and no, the Bible's perfect and the Bible doesn't have any variations. And if you make that argument, you are intellectually incorrect. And it makes you look bad because somebody who is a critic of the Bible will say, wait, I know there's lots of variations in the various copies. And you need to say, yes, there are. And that then raises the job of what textual critics do. So what do we do with that? Well, first of all, even if, and it depends on who's counting as the number people get to, and we don't need to go down this road too far, but somebody on the high end could say there's 400,000 variations. Okay, fine. But depending on who's counting, what you really end up with is only about 10% of the total text is in question. Meaning, I just said, 100 words. So 10 of the words of the 100 are in question, meaning most of the other words scot-free, meaning from all of the thousands of variations of copies of, say, the book of Mark, when you're reading 90 of the words, all the variations have the same word. That'd be true also, by the way, for Julius Caesar, for Suetonius, for Pliny, for Tacitus. Most of the words or most of the copies are identical, meaning no copyist is trying to lie into the text. Nobody's trying to say, let me screw this up or create some major mistakes or problems that'll throw people later. They're not trying to put lies into the mouth of Cicero. Mm-hmm. They're just trying to say, this is what's here. But the setting of doing the copying can lead to variations that have come out here. Now, I mentioned Dr. Paul Wegner, who has written a lot and done a lot of research on the idea of how the creation of the Bible has come up. He says it this way. Although Old Testament textual criticism is more subjective than New Testament criticism, meaning the critical text work, the task of both, meaning textual critics for both, is to evaluate which reading or variant of the text is more likely than the original, which is right, which reflects the original. Variants are not the same as errors. They are rather differences in wording amongst the various manuscripts. So if you remember, we've talked about how there are actually about 6,500 Greek manuscripts, and if you bring in all the other translations from Latin and others, over 26,000 manuscripts, which again, a lot more than 49. And so you can imagine that there can be a lot of differences, and there can be a lot of differences. But as you work your way through the process, they're able to kind of come down on the side of understanding like what probably happened here, and they're able to kind of see these kind of work together. And they've got like a series of like rules that they use to kind of determine like, well, which variation do I lean into? I've got different ones, like I said, these and there, and you might think, well, that doesn't matter, but that would count as a variant. Right. Is it supposed to be, did they say these? And if you said, if it's supposed to be there and the person wrote these, the sentence probably doesn't make sense, probably doesn't read right in your ears. You're okay, something's wrong here. And so you can catch those kind of easily. Mm-hmm. And so what do we do with that? Okay, so here, these are not in order of like identification or ranking. Here's 4. There's more than 4, but here's some of the rules that are used. Mm-hmm. One is that the older reading is preferred. So remember, we were able to date most of these copies. So I've told you about manuscript fragments from the early 2nd century. We've talked about whole collections of the Bible by the mid-3rd century into the 4th century. But then we have copies that are from the 9th century, when Charlemagne did a whole bunch of his works. We have a lot of copies from that time window. And so if there's a variation in a 9th century document that differs from the 3rd century document, you're going to lean to the 3rd century document as being the correct one because it's closer to the original. Second, the shorter reading is generally preferred. Now what that means is sometimes if a sentence says, he went there, and then another copy says, he went to the library over there. The he went there is typically preferred because it's shorter, because scribes often did not try to take words out. But a scribe in the 9th century might have thought, well, where did he go? And then maybe he reads in the rest of the text and sees there's a library involved. So he goes back up to this short sentence and adds to the library there. So he inserts to the library. So then the textual scholar goes, I think that was probably inserted. And again, there's more than you do. You combine all these together. Thirdly, the harder or the more difficult reading is generally preferred. Now, this one's harder for me to come up on the fly with an example, but in general terms, if the two examples are one of them is it makes it sound really difficult. Like maybe it shines a bad light on one of the disciples, or it's a complicated way of saying something. And then there's another example that has really smoothed that out, or perhaps even removed the negative comment about or maybe tries to explain the disciples' actions by adding a few extra words that kind of makes it sound a little nicer than the scholars are typically thinking. Rarely is a scribe making it harder. Right. So that kind of a thing. And then fourthly, and again, these are not in any order, where the thing is found. Like, where is the copy from? So remember, we're starting in Jerusalem where the events happened. Then you start spreading out. And as you start spreading out, and remember, Christianity by the 5th century is throughout the Roman Empire. So as far as West Britain, we've got Christians up in Ireland, up in Scotland, through all the Iberian Peninsula. So if they find a copy in, say, Navarre, which is northern Iberian Peninsula, and they find a copy, and they have a copy that's maybe roughly the same age, that's in Antioch, which is close to Jerusalem. Generally speaking, they're assuming the one closer in location might have precedence over the one that's further away. That
stands to reason.
Took longer.
Right.
And they put all these together. And one of the cool things that comes out of this is with this idea of geography is because there's so many manuscripts, the experts now can sort of begin to trace backwards into creating what is the equivalent of like a family of text. So again, imagine something was you and I are sitting in Winter Park, Florida, so the larger Central Florida area. And so imagine there was a text that was written here, and then somebody took a copy of it to Jacksonville, and somebody took a copy of it to Tallahassee. And then in Tallahassee, a copy was made and taken to Pensacola, from Pensacola to New Orleans. Whereas in Jacksonville, a copy was taken to Savannah, and from Savannah to Raleigh, right? If you're later, the expert, reading only the New Orleans copy and the Raleigh copy, and you see differences, but you know that there's an original that was in Tallahassee and in Jacksonville, where you can see some differences, you realize, oh, the New Orleans one is kind of a descendant of the copy that went first to Tallahassee.
There's a lineage to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's 4 major families, and we don't need to get into all the examples of this, but they kind of have them as both geographical and they're connected in some sense to like where the oldest document is. So for instance, I've mentioned to you before Codex Vaticanus, which is one of the oldest copies of the whole Bible that we have. And so that's what's called the Alexandrian family. And most scholars consider that family the most accurate. And so there's 4 other families. One's called Caesarean, one's called Western, one's called Byzantine. If you know your history, Byzantine, you go, oh, that's like near Constantinople. Exactly. That's where Codex Alexandrinus, which is also 4th century, is like the major early family member of the Byzantine family. Now listen, don't let the word family or most or least accurate throw you into thinking the scholars just randomly choose. They don't, at least not since modern times. I have here with me the 5th edition of the Greek New Testament. Now in seminary, I took some Greek. I will not claim to be able to read Greek on the fly. One of my professors could, and when we studied the book of John together, he would be reading straight from the Greek and translating as he went along.
Baller.
Yeah, amazing. But I can read it. I do have the sources to help me kind of understand it. And if you could look at this book, you would see that page after page after page, there's places where the scholars demonstrate and show, well, this is where there's a variation in the text. And there's a whole system by which they go into, in which they kind of rank and measure and judge. And this idea of looking at them and kind of collecting one unified version of the most accurate text we have, from which scholars who are doing translations. So if you have an NIV Bible or the New Living Bible or the English Standard Version Bible, those experts that they hired to help them create the text for that Bible started with this thing I'm holding in my hands. That's where they would go from. They wouldn't try to get the 20,000 manuscripts around them and try to pick out. They would say the scholars have done this. And some of the names that are worth exploring coming out of the really 1800s are B.F. Westcott, F.J.A. Hort, Eberhard Nestle. Some of these were the very first ones in the 1800s and 1900s to really begin to say this is something we can do collectively as we've gotten more and more of the manuscripts. And then in the 20th century, experts like Kurt Aland and Bruce Metzger, they're really crucial in kind of working their way through. Okay, I'm going to pause. That's a lot, too much of me. But can you see kind of the complexity of it, and at the same time, because you don't read Greek, you're just reading the Bible and you just kind of hope it's good. Can you see how that should totally build your confidence level as to like what you're reading is what was actually written?
Yeah, it's a good kind of pulling the curtain back to how we got the Bible, and as you've already distinguished, important to point out what we're talking about here is over here as far as variants. Over here is, a whole different category of where people would say the Bible is wrong, or there's a historical mistake, or there's a patent contradiction. Even if you read the Bible, every now and then there's a little footnote.
Yep.
It says, we don't know this is our best understanding of this word, but we don't know the original meaning in the original text. This has been in our Bibles forever, in our modern Bibles. So
yeah, and
this is not something foreign.
Yeah, and particularly if you get a study Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you look at that, what they're saying is they're pointing back to this compilation document. Here's the end result. When you look at the overwhelming manuscript evidence, the consensus about the text is that there's really, like, the Bible is like 99.5% on the money. So there is still 0.05%, like you said, that where they're going, yeah, we're still not totally clear. The evidence leads us to a place, and they will say it very clearly in the book I was just referencing, where they're like, the scholars are divided. Maybe it's these, maybe it is there. We're not 100% sure.
And if you were making something up, why would you do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's dumb.
And most of those variants of the 0.05% are just literally misspellings or word order. Like sometimes it might say, Lord, have mercy on us. And the other Greek one might say, have mercy on us, Lord. So it's a variant, and we count it.
Yeah.
But that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's not live or die. Details matter, but that's a great example to go, oh,
right.
They're the same thing.
There are a few that are bigger. Right? Somebody knows their Bible. Like there's a question about the ending of the book of Mark. There's a very famous story in, say, John chapter 8. And I get that. Here's the kind of final point is that at no point is any major doctrine question in jeopardy because of this. And so if you're a reader, you can say, look, I realize no document from antiquity is going to be 100% pure, quote unquote. Most of them, I would say, are like 90. So if you pick up Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, you can imagine 95% of it is exactly what Julius Caesar wrote. And there's 5% where the experts are like, we're not totally sure. We know this is what's in the copies, but there's enough variation in the copies that we're like not 100% certain like what's there. Or in some places, we don't even have it. We just say, sorry, it's missing. So we didn't try to include it. But that should give us great confidence when we're reading any work from antiquity, but then the Iliad higher than any work, and the New Testament in particular, but the Bible collectively higher than the Iliad from a sense of that's what was written. It's so good.
That's good.
Okay. Quickly then, shifting to the question of contradictions. And again, this is another one of those where it's like I could spend hours going through. So are there places in the Bible where it's like, oh, this one passage says one thing, and then this other passage says something different? Absolutely there are. Some experts would say there's as many as like 800 or 900. Well, what do I do with that as a historian? So now we're talking about the collective story, and we're going to keep our focus for now, just to make it better in our time, on like the life of Jesus, right?
Okay.
So just the story of Jesus, the New Testament. And so fair enough. Again, I'm with you. If you're telling me this thing happened, but then the people that are telling me this stuff, I mean, nobody says whether Jesus was right or left-handed. But if somebody's saying he's right-handed and somebody says he's left-handed, if somebody says he was born in Bethlehem and somebody was saying, no, he was born in Antioch, okay, that sounds like a problem, and let's dig into it. By the way, none of those examples are what's in there, but I'm just saying that that's the kind of thing. So first of all, to understand, when you're reading antiquity, You can't be thinking that what I'm reading is understood as the way we understand something today. So those 4 biographies we've mentioned before, they're called Gospels, right? Biography is really unfair if I say that.
Yeah. These are not Neil Gabler or Walter Isaacson.
Exactly.
I would love for that.
Yes.
But what we have is what we need to have, we believe.
And the reason is because, and this is true across the ancient world, Egyptian biographies, Greek biographies, Persian biographies, at that time, the viewpoint of why you held someone up in a biography was to basically teach the reader something valuable that you, the author, thinks that the person demonstrates. So it's illustrating a part of their life that you think is worthy of learning and remembering. They weren't ever like, let's intentionally lie about the details, but they weren't as worried about the details.
Different focus.
Exactly. And if you think, by the way, listener, that, well, that's terrible because nobody does that today, you've obviously not read modern texts that are aimed at telling us a true story about some event. And you just have to pay attention just randomly here in the early 21st century. And I know you've heard the phrase fake news, and I'm not going to fake news level, but what I'm saying, when somebody says fake news, what they're saying is what you said about an event, I don't believe, or I think that there's been some shaping and maybe even slandering with the information. And that's part of the consternation that's happening in the 21st century here. But the point is, authors do that. They write with the bias, they write with the slant, and so that's part of the story. Also, when you look at the latter writings in the New Testament, those are literally letters, right? So it'd be like somebody having someone's emails. I don't know about you, but I don't write my emails thinking some later generation is going to pull them out.
Right.
I just write my email, and it might have all kinds of stuff in there that later, if I even read it, I might go, I probably should have said that differently. But I'm just writing the letter.
Right.
And so that's what Paul, James, John, Peter, they were all doing that. Now, again, some of the writings, like Romans, for instance, or maybe James's single letter, you might think he probably had a little bit more planning, but still we need to think of it as an actual letter from an actual human to an actual recipient. And then with like the writings, the histories were similar in the sense that they were not done the way a modern historian would write or document. We're coming up into the USA 250 in 2026. If you've not read any history about the USA founding, trust me, you're going to see an avalanche of books probably already coming out or coming out now. And if you read those, we have a certain expectation in the 21st century about what a historian will do, and try not to hide or said anything. But even as I say that, I think immediately one of the big debates within the historical circles, in particular as a professor, is, are you as a professor finding the minority voice, the obscured voice, and pulling that information out and bringing it into the narrative? Are you including the voices of the marginalized or the conquered or the defeated? And a lot of times when you read histories, even in the 21st century, they are not doing that. And so when you read a history of the Old Testament or read the book of Acts from Dr. Luke, I want you to realize, if you think there's something missing, the fact that something may be missing does not mean that the book is of no value or does not tell you a true history. It's just like all books, really. There may be a slant, there may be a focus. Like in the book of Acts, one of the key people in the New Testament story is this guy Peter. And he's held up within the Catholic Church in particular as like one of the most important, if not the most important person after Jesus. And in the book of Acts, like chapter 8, he just disappears. And as a reader, you're ticked off about that. Like, dude, what happened to Peter? If it's the Acts of the Apostles, where's Peter? And then where are the other dudes? Tell me all the other guys.
I've heard people talking about documentaries, and like, you know, if you try really hard, certainly there's got to be a way to be unbiased in it. And so, okay, how would we do that? Well, what if you just, there's a scene happening and you just film, there's no narration, and you just point the camera. Even there, you are making a decision to put that on camera and something else not off camera. You are still, the bias is still there on some level. Even if it's innocuous, you've got a preference for what's important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think when you do a careful reading of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels and the Acts, which give us a little bit of historical take, I think you can see that there's a careful, measured tone There's no flamboyancy in the wording or the writing. The facts line up historically and, as you said earlier, archaeologically. So when you look then and say, are there supposed contradictions? Well, before I even answer this, let me show you one of my favorite stories from history. So in the Second Punic Wars, the Roman Republic is fighting against their great opponent in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. In the Second Punic War, there's a Carthaginian general named Hannibal, and he famously crosses both the Pyrenees Mountains and the Alps with a very large army that included war elephants. So the way I tell my students that we're challenging some of these events, I'm like, I grew up in the mountains of East Tennessee. I was in the mountains a lot. I've even climbed mountains with gear, although normally I'm bouldering or just walking with no gear. Ain't no way no elephant is crossing those mountains. That's what Carl, the East Tennessee hillbilly redneck, would say. Ain't no way. And yet, Carl, this historian says, I've got historical evidence that says it happened. I've got archaeological evidence. I've got multiple attestation in writings from Roman sources, not Carthaginian sources. So why would they make it up? And so I've got this fact. And when you look at those sources, like, so the leading sources are from Polybius and Livy. All right. I know you may go, I don't know those names, but they're people who wrote Roman histories. Polybius writing in 167, Livy writing around 29 after the Republic's actually fallen. And so when you read these two sources, they tell us about Hannibal crossing the Alps. But when you dig into it, and I don't have time to give all of them to you, when you dig into it, you find out there's a host of places where the two texts contradict each other. So, for instance, when the army first reached Italy, well, Polybius says it's the 11th day. Livy says it's the 12th day. Well, which one is it, right? There's supposedly various tribes that they run into. Gallic tribes who are in modern-day France, some Italian tribes in the northern Italian region. They don't have them, the Carthaginians, interacting with the exact same tribes. In some cases, they don't say it happened at all. In other cases, they list a whole bunch of tribes that the other one never, ever mentions. You get a difference on the number of soldiers. So Polybius says that he had done first-person research, and he found an actual historical marker, he says, set up by Hannibal that gives a number, 38,000 soldiers, 8,000 cavalry, about 80 elephants. Okay. But Livy actually spoke to someone who was a Roman who'd been captive and so was with the army, and he quotes this guy. So we got a first-person source who quotes the army as being 80,000. So we're not debating, you and I, and we're not going to get into it and let the Roman history scholars get into it, to kind of suss out the difference between those two sources. But what we're trying to note is that at no point does a serious historian doubt the veracity of the event that Hannibal crossed the Alps, no matter how hard it is for Carl to understand, with elephants. War elephants climbed the Pyrenees Mountains and the Alps. And I'm talking about documentaries. I've seen some recent documentaries in, say, the past 5 years. We still can't find the way that he did it. We're not sure how in the world that he got through with elephants. But yet we have these sources, but the sources disagree in detail. So then we're left with saying, well, am I going to believe this event, or am I going to call it all a lie? If I want to call it a lie, I need to call everything from history a lie. There's no reason to do that. I just have to accept the fact that, yes, some of the sources leaves me with questions about the details, but that doesn't mean the event didn't happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does.
So the same thing can happen with the Bible, right? And I mentioned earlier Norman Geisler. He's probably the foremost expert on this idea of contradictions. He's gathered like hundreds of these into this ginormous book called When Critics Ask. You want to read it? I mean, it literally starts in Genesis and it goes to Revelation and gives what he believes is an explanation as to how you answer it. Whether you agree with him on all of his things, there's some places I read through it and I'm like, I don't think that's what I would say about a contradiction. It's not the point. The point is that he and other experts would tell us, look, there's ways to answer, just like with Hannibal. There's ways to work it out. Was the 11th day or the 12th day? We can figure that out, and it doesn't mean the event didn't happen. It could just mean that, yes, one of them maybe is not given the correct information, or there may be something else to do with how they understood, like the sun and the dates and all those kinds of things. You kind of work your way through. Right. And as he's going through, I mean, Geisler's got 17 rules of how you interpret. We don't need to get into all those, but there's a few, like I've told you this before. The text is given the benefit of the doubt until it proves itself out as a liar, just because it disagrees with another one of the evidences. The fact that it's unexplained, like elephants crossing out mountains, does not mean that it's unexplainable.
Right.
If you have multiple passages that are involved, you might have something that helps you understand what seems difficult to understand. And then the fact that something may be incomplete or partial doesn't necessarily mean that it's false.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. This is the standard that's in science.
Yes.
Our knowledge leads us up to here. From beyond here, we're theorizing about this. And many times over time, a new discovery is made. And you're like, by golly, we were pretty close, that we were right on that thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that your knowledge is false if it's not all fully in place at one given time.
Let me give you one example, and then we'll get out of here. So the 4 gospel writers all talk about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. It's the core event, which we'll talk about next week. They give slightly different versions of what Pontius Pilate put on a plaque that he had posted above Jesus' head. And so he put a plaque up there. All 4 of them, though, give the core idea that Pilate was saying this man was king of the Jews. And as we may talk about next week, the Jewish leaders were furious, like, take that down. That's not true. Put up there that he said he was king of the Jews. And Pilate's like, look, dudes, I wrote what I wrote. The fact that all 4 of them don't have the exact same saying does not mean that, A, it didn't happen. We can say it did happen because they all 4 mention it. Nor does it mean, well, I'm not going to believe what Matthew ever wrote anywhere else because he doesn't have the same thing that Luke wrote. Maybe Luke has the right one because he's the better historian. That's not the way a historian should think about it. A contradiction would be if one of the gospel writers said there was no plaque, Pilate had nothing to do with it. Or if the sign had been hung on one of the other guys' crosses and said, this guy says he's king of the Jews.
Right.
Then you'd have a problem.
They can't both be true.
Exactly.
Right.
So here you could see how there's a way to work your way through it, and Geisler does, others do. You probably can think it about yourself, listener, as the way to figure out, just the 4 different guys, as they're creating 4 different reports at different times and in different locations, their sources led them to this part. But they all say the same thing, and there's not a way that it kind of defeats one or the other. Okay, look. The core issue is just like with other historical events, though we may find some differences as difficult, we might even think that they're unsolvable, we can't make sense of it. These differences would never, for any serious historian, bring doubts about the truthfulness of the event. So we can say the text we read is highly accurate, and then when we look at it, say evidence to evidence, so Livy versus Polybius or Luke versus Mark, though there are some differences in detail, those differences are explainable and do not present any core issue with the truthfulness of the narrative. That leads me to conclude, as I've said before, the Bible is not only the most historically accurate writing of antiquity, but it is one that is consistent with itself. It tells one overarching story of God, the phrase I've used, the Maker, who is the one and who's living, and he reaches to humans through this man named Jesus. All right, now we've built this story to here. You feel good?
I feel great. Looking forward to what's next.
Yeah, because what we need to do now is, knowing that this is historically secure, we need to get into the most challenging potential story. It's a true story, but it's got a lot of questions. And if I don't think elephants can, I'll just say it right now, people don't come back to life. Humans don't come back to life. So Carl, the redneck hillbilly from East Tennessee, is going, there ain't no way that happened. But I've got historical evidence that we're going to have to look at and see if we can figure out what's going on there and see if that is actually a historical event or not.
Well, count me in. I'm intrigued.
All right, buddy. See you then.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/uncovered.